DARKSIDE DREAMS by A. King Bradley. Story 1, The Witness. Chapter 1, Seattle, Washington, August 22nd, 2087. The city was dark and quiet, awash in a cold rain. The usual miscreants seemed to be hiding away for the night, snuggled up tight in their crack dens and cheap hotel rooms. Even the rats were nowhere to be seen. Officer Raymond Ray Bridges looked skyward, narrowing his eyes. The rain just kept coming, and the unusually brisk winds that came with it brought forth a chill that he could feel right down to his bones. The cup of decaf in his hand helped a little, but it was already starting to go cold. Just like the fire in his belly, 19 years on the job would do that to anyone, especially in this city. Ray moved away from the sidewalk and tucked himself into the vestibule of a dark shop, staring longingly up at the lighted windows high on the office building across the street as he leaned against the brick building to his left. Night owls and workaholics, still plugging away even at this hour. 1:45 by his watch. 15 minutes until he could head back to the station and turn in. Only a few more days left on this god-awful night shift before the new kid arrives and takes over. Ray stood there, sipping his now cold decaf and listening closely to the radio chatter coming from his belt, hoping nothing would come in that he might need to respond to. It had been a quiet shift, mostly on account of the rain and the chill. He hoped it would have the courtesy to remain that way until after he was home, safe and snug in bed with a glass of whiskey in his hand and one of his late-night shows streaming at a low volume on his slate, the perfect way to coax his overactive mind to sleep. 2 different numbing agents, one applied through the optic nerve and the other through his gullet. Headlights suddenly flashed through the rain. Tires hissed over wet pavement. The car appeared, parallel parking with inhuman speed and ease in front of the apartment building. Ray narrowed his eyes, peering through the window of the car. No driver, none visible anyway. Probably just a drunk in the back seat who let his car drive him home. But best to check on it. He stepped out of the vestibule and back into the icy, insidious rain. He looked both ways, then jogged across the mirrored surface of the wet asphalt street. He pressed a spot under the brim of his hat, between his thumb and forefinger, and the PD insignia on the front of it lit up like a headlamp, shining a cone of light ahead of him. Ray rapped against the car window with his knuckles. A moment later, a bleary-eyed figure sat up out of the shadows of the back seat and reached over the center console to lower the window. "Officer," he said, "I'm not in trouble, am I?" Ray could have smelled the alcohol from a mile away. No sign of any illicit substances, though, not that he could see. Technically, the guy wasn't doing anything wrong. 40 years ago, it would have been illegal for a self-driving car to be moving around without a coherent, license-holding person behind the wheel. Just in case anything went wrong with the computer, but nowadays self-driving cars were so advanced that manual driving was essentially obsolete. "Been out drinking tonight?" Ray asked. "Yeah, officer. Yeah, just drinking. Just a few." "Nothing else, huh? No weapons or drugs in here, right?" Ray turned his head from side to side, playing his light through the car. It was a small cab, nowhere to really hide anything. "No, sir, nothing like that. Just a few drinks." "Okay," said Ray. "Have a nice night." Ray stepped away, walking back down the street in the direction of his cruiser. Just as he was sliding into the seat, a call came. It was the call he had been dreading. He sighed, glancing at the time, 11:57 p.m. He had almost made it. The call was for a reported disturbance at the Holy Rapture Center. Ray knew the place. It was the source of many rumors and local urban legends. A hidden compound secluded at the edge of the city limits, near heavily forested state land. Highly fortified and very secretive. No one knew much about it, except that they supposedly performed charitable and spiritual outreach. Most of the stories were probably baloney. Reports of dozens of hooded figures in heavy robes chanting in some strange language, rumors of screams echoing from the compound. The official opinion was that the so-called screams were just the foxes that lived in the nearby forest, and that if these people wanted to go around chanting in robes, there wasn't a damn thing anyone could do to stop them. The place had always given Ray the heebie-jeebies, mostly because his upbringing had taught him to be wary of organized religion. As far as he was concerned, the Holy Rapture Center was much the same as any other church, mosque, or synagogue. The call went out again, but Ray remained silent. He wasn't the only cop working the night shift, so he was hoping that one of his colleagues would respond. They didn't. Typical for calls involving the Holy Rapture Center. One could easily find themselves on the wrong end of a giant lawsuit just by setting foot on the organization's premises, and they certainly didn't make any exceptions for the authorities. The dispatcher tried a third time, probably rolling her eyes and blowing out her cheeks in exasperation. By now, the clock was about 30 seconds shy of midnight. Ray reached for his handset, then paused and thought long and hard. If he pressed that button, he was in it. Could be hours before he got home, depending on what was happening out there. The dispatcher launched into her spiel a fourth time. Ray couldn't take it anymore. Too painful. He pressed the button. "This is Bridges," he said. "What's the situation?" "Got a call from a concerned citizen. They were out for a walk." "Copy. Go ahead." "Said they heard some, quote, blood-curdling screams over at the Rapture Center." "Go ahead." "Nothing witnessed. No visual sign of any trouble, but the witness said it definitely wasn't animal noises." "A human scream, huh?" Ray asked rhetorically. "Heard that one before. I'll respond. I sure hope I don't need backup, though, since I'm apparently the only person working tonight." The dispatcher laughed. "Copy that, Bridges." "Will the RP be there?" "Didn't say. Just hung up the phone on me." "Roger. En route now." He released the handset and turned to his dash tab. It was a large touchscreen slate built into the center between two sleek air vents. There was a list of ongoing calls by code and time since they were called in, as well as the associated addresses. Ray looked for the one at the Holy Rapture Center, tapped it, and sat back to let his car do the work. The vehicle automatically switched on and took off at 5 miles per hour over the speed limit. "Maestro, light him up for me, will you?" Ray said, speaking to the popular AI virtual assistant that was integrated with his standard-issue police cruiser. "Done," Maestro's velvety yet clearly synthesized voice replied through the police cruiser's speaker system. "Should I start the siren as well?" "No need, doll," Ray answered as he leaned his seat back and made himself more comfortable. "Not much traffic between here and the Holy Rapture Center." Chapter 2. Ray didn't realize he had dozed off until the nudge of a speed bump woke him up. The rain continued to soak the world outside his speeding self-driving cruiser as he quickly sat forward, blinked a few times, and shook his head. He was nearing the edge of the city limits. The car crossed a set of railroad tracks, dark and desolate in either direction. The old station house stood nearby, decrepit and crumbling, and covered in graffiti. A few vagrants were probably in there now, tucked into the few corners that didn't have gaping holes in the roof above them, enjoying their cheap bottles of liquor or expensive needles of heroin, or else shivering themselves to sleep. Past that point, Ray entered the place he often called No Man's Land, the more thinly populated outskirts of the city. A place that was covered mostly in creeping wilderness and homes abandoned at the height of the most recent market crisis. Technically, this area was under the jurisdiction of Ray's department, but since most of the crime happened deeper inside the city, the few calls that came from these desolate areas generally took longer to be responded to. Even the road commission and snowplows seemed to ignore the place. It was autumn now, so Ray's cruiser didn't quite have to plow through snowdrifts yet, but the ride was still far from perfect. The asphalt in this area was all but destroyed from many years of neglect. Huge cracks, potholes the size of an extra-large pizza. The car dodged all the major hazards with expert precision, but it was still a bumpy ride. You never knew what sort of nightmare might spring up in front of your headlights out here in the middle of the night. Suddenly, the car slammed its brakes on. Ray's body strained forward against the seatbelt. The car bumped and growled over the uneven road surface and then came to a screeching stop. Glancing at the HUD, which had long since replaced the standard instrument panel, Ray saw that the car's Maestro system had detected a collision threat in the road. Ray didn't see anything, not even with the high beams on. He lifted himself off his seat, nudging his head against the ceiling and straining his eyes to see through the windshield. Suddenly, an old man appeared, rising from a low position just in front of the car's front grille. He squinted, raising a hand to block the light from his eyes. His face was deeply lined, etched with worry and exhaustion. He wore a long, neat beard and a set of voluminous robes, which included a hood that protected his head from the rain. By now, the rain had lessened to a mere drizzle. The occasional flashes of lightning came from farther and farther away, the roar of thunder echoing with increasing distance and diminishing power. Ray shook his head, grunting in annoyance. He could already feel that this would be a long one. It was becoming one of those perfect nights where all the weirdos filtered out of the woodwork all at once. The rain had apparently picked a bad time to slow down. He rolled his window down but did not stick his head out. For all he knew, there might be someone coming up behind him now, ready to slam a baseball bat into the back of his skull. He had heard too many horror stories about hijackings that followed a similar MO. Someone waits in the road and stops the car, asking for help. Someone else sneaks up and attacks. "Hey!" Ray called out. "Take a step back and show me your hands, both of them." The old man complied, stepping away from the car and raising both hands, spreading his fingers. The billowy sleeves of his robe fell down as well, revealing surprisingly muscular forearms. Still, Ray was mostly satisfied, certain that the guy had no weapons on him. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Ray ordered. "Walk around near my window here, but keep your distance." Again, the elderly man complied, positioning himself where Ray could see all of him, but staying at a distance of about 6 feet. "You from the Rapture Center?" Ray questioned. The old man's face sagged even further. He nodded. "What are you doing out here?" Ray asked. "I was praying," the old man answered in a weary, grief-laden voice. "In the middle of the road? I apologize, officer." "I almost ran you over," Ray snapped. "No, you didn't. The Maestro would never allow that to happen. The technology, it saves, just as much as it destroys." "Mister," Ray said, growing impatient, "you aren't making much sense. What are you doing out here?" "Praying." "Praying for what, exactly?" Ray asked. "The souls I was forced to leave behind," the man replied, looking off to his left. Probably in the general direction of the Holy Rapture Center, which couldn't be more than a mile away now. Ray looked off in the distance, trying to see if he could make out the religious compound through the vast blanket of darkness that shrouded this part of the city. "Are you the one who called the disturbance in?" Ray queried, turning his attention back to the mysterious old man. "Yes, but that was a mistake. I shouldn't have done that. It's not my place." Ray gritted his teeth and studied the man's leathery face as the old fellow continued to ramble. This man was hiding something. Ray was sure of it. If there really was something bad going on at the Rapture Center, he couldn't sit around listening to this guy's unintelligible babble for much longer. "What's happening at the Rapture Center?" Ray demanded. "What have you seen?" The old man tipped his head back, staring up into the overcast sky. "It's him. He's back. They've been judged and found to be unworthy. If it's his will, then who am I to interfere?" the man replied, again looking in the general direction of the Holy Rapture Center. Ray grunted as he followed the man's gaze only to see nothing in particular. "How about a real answer?" Ray groaned as he turned his attention back towards the man, only to realize that the man had disappeared. "Hey!" Ray called out as he spotted the eccentric elder darting away in the distance. "Stop right there! If you have information—" The old man was gone, vanished into the night. Ray was in great shape for a man in his early 50s. He probably could have run the delirious old man down, but something in the pit of his stomach told him that checking out the Holy Rapture Center was more important. A part of him also thought it would probably turn out to be nothing, but Ray had to be sure. "Let's go, Maestro," he said, and the vehicle sprang back into action, climbing out of a pothole and trundling off toward the Holy Rapture Center. Out there, amongst the silence and infinite darkness, it was easy to find the reclusive religious compound. Once it came into Ray's view over the black horizon in the distance, it stood out like a beacon, a lighthouse in the unfathomable depths of night. Ray sat up straighter, took control of the vehicle, and manually steered up to the towering front gate. He squinted through the windshield, trying to see past the blinding floodlights that were positioned to converge at the edge of the property. The air was misty with humidity, and he could see nothing but indistinct shapes through the haze. A gazebo, a fountain, vine-covered trellises, benches that stood to either side of the garden path. All that, beyond the imposing steel gate that stood before him. A sign on the gate advised that the Holy Rapture Center was open to scheduled visitors between the hours of 9 a.m. and 4 p.m., except on Sundays, when they were only open until noon. There was an additional sign which gave instructions for anyone who wished to request a meeting or speak to a center representative. Ray scanned the gate for a call button and finally spotted one on a keypad to the left side of the signage. "Sit tight, doll," Ray said, giving his cruiser's dash a ceremonial pat. "I'll be back in a jiffy." He got out and stepped over wet pavement to the keypad by the gate. He pressed the button twice, keeping his other hand on the butt of his sidearm. Then he approached the gate, peering through with narrowed eyes, trying to discern anything at all in the mist. The floodlights up at the main building itself, 30 yards away, cut through the mist a bit and offered a clear view of the front steps, but little else. The doors at the top of those steps opened. After a few moments, a hooded figure emerged, dressed in a flowing white garment with a wide, red, billowing sash. He strode gracefully down the steps and through the mist, parting it to either side in curling waves. He came up to the gate, brandishing his right hand in the gesture of some religious orator. As he drew near, the man lowered his hood and revealed a veritable waterfall of brunette hair. That, along with his pointed beard, his large eyes, and his sharp nose, gave him the exact look of Jesus Christ himself. Perhaps not the historically accurate look, but the one most people knew. His smile was gentle, and his voice was soft as he lay a hand against the bars of the gate and spoke. "Raymond Bridges," the man said. Ray stood in confused silence, wondering if the man was seconds away from completing a sentence or simply letting him know that he somehow already knew his name. "Officer Bridges is fine," Ray finally remarked after the strange Jesus-looking figure remained silent. Ray took out his proper flashlight and beamed it straight into the guy's eyes. His pupils dilated, but he didn't blink or narrow his eyes at all. "You too will be judged should you choose to enter. Is that what you want, Officer Bridges?" "Is that some kind of threat?" Ray asked, placing his hand on the butt of his sidearm once again. "A simple question, my child. Nothing more, nothing less," the man remarked. "Is this some kind of cosplay deal or something?" Ray asked, wondering if the odd man was acting so strange out of a desire to remain in character. "How may I assist you, Officer Bridges?" the man inquired. "You probably already know this, but we received a call about a disturbance out here. I just need to get inside and take a look. Just need to see what's going on, that's all." The Jesus look-alike nodded, and his peaceful expression momentarily ignited with glee. "Of course. For what good is the Lord's work without a witness?" he chimed, just before his stoic expression returned. "I will delay your judgment, Officer Bridges, and for now you are granted safe passage. that you may bear witness to the work that I have done." "What work? What are you talking about?" Ray called out, as the man turned and left the gate without another word, going back the way he came, and again parting the mists, which had only just settled back into place. Raymond called after him again, but the man ignored his words, climbed the steps, and disappeared inside the center. The door swung shut behind him, closing softly on hydraulic hinges. Ray was just about to press the call button once again when, to his surprise, a buzzing sound suddenly rang out, causing the front gate to automatically open along mechanical tracks. Ray looked back at his car, trying to determine if he should drive it inside and keep it close to the door. He also considered arming himself with the heavier weaponry he kept in the trunk just in case, but he ultimately decided against it. He looked back inside the compound, at the calm mists and the silent gardens of the Rapture Center. From the outside, it sure didn't look like anything was out of the ordinary, but he couldn't ignore the disturbance call, the crazy old man in the street, and certainly not the bizarre Jesus look-alike who had just seemingly threatened him with his coded judgment babble. Still, bringing out the big guns was probably a bit much for what could very well end up being a false alarm. Probably nothing here, Ray thought as he eyed the front entrance to the main building. I'll just take a peek around then, head back to the station. 10 minutes, tops, Ray continued as he pictured himself back in his cruiser and heading home. Humming to himself, he walked slowly up the path toward the building, shining the strong beam of his flashlight around. Nothing but wet grass and drooping flowers so far. The front entrance was unlocked, and therefore Ray opened the door with ease and then stepped into the center. It was dark inside. The only light visible was shining from somewhere down a hall, suffusing the grand entry room with the softest of glows. Ray twisted the end of his flashlight, which caused the light to dim, but also to widen and cover a broader area. That's when he saw the bodies. At first he thought he was looking at religious iconography, variations of the standard bloody crucified Jesus you see everywhere. These were highly realistic, though, displayed in demeaning heaps on the floor, in various states of agony and frozen into place. One of them was even draped over a bench, fingers and toes hanging to the floor on either side. He knew what a dead body generally looked like, especially one that had been dead for longer than 10 or 20 minutes. With every passing minute, they looked less like a human being and more like a doll, a dull simulacrum. The skin went pale and waxy, depending on the amount of blood loss. The limbs went stiff. If the body was moved after rigor mortis set in, the posture of death would be maintained, and the resulting appearance of the body would be even more surreal, even less human. Ray took a deep breath, and the thick metallic stench of blood filled his nose. A spike of fear and shock rippled through him like a jolt of electricity. He spun around and drew his sidearm, resting his gun hand over the wrist of the one holding the flashlight. Ray wanted to believe otherwise, but he knew these people were dead, long since deceased, hence the unreal appearance. Otherwise, he never would have mistaken them for statues or dummies. He turned in a slow circle, surveying the room, looking for any signs of movement. This was a big place, an atrium, 3 levels, doors everywhere, offshoot hallways leading to God knows where. The man he had seen, the one who both looked and spoke like a stereotypical Jesus Christ, had been through here less than a minute ago. He had briefly spoken with Ray and even buzzed him in, but why didn't he say anything about the bodies? And then there was the thinly veiled judgment threats. This man was the killer. Ray was sure of it, and it was clear that his apparent killing spree was the work that he had wanted Ray to witness. Still, Ray wished that he would have gotten a better look at the Jesus imposter. After years of analyzing blood spatter, he could tell if someone had been present at a killing, just by the size and shape of blood spots on his or her clothing. It bothered him that he couldn't recall if the strange man had blood on his robe, but he was still convinced that the look-alike was likely the culprit. On reflex, Ray tapped his hat light back on and used the flashlight hand to manipulate his radio. "Officer Bridges, requesting immediate assistance, he said. Officer Bridges, immediate backup required at the Holy Rapture Center. Multiple homicides. Perpetrator still in the vicinity. Exact whereabouts unknown. No answer. But why? Ray knew he should have heard word of backup being on its way immediately, given the nature of his request. But now 30 or 40 seconds had passed, and he was getting nothing but radio silence. Not even the dispatcher had replied. He switched his radio to a more general channel. Still, he heard nothing but static and a bit of interference, likely from a signal jammer hidden somewhere on the premises. If he wanted a clear signal, he would have to go back outside and put some distance between him and the compound. But that would mean leaving the scene. An act of cowardice in Ray's mind. He had not yet fully assessed the threat, and he couldn't shake the feeling that there might be survivors farther inside the building, people who might need his help. People who could easily lose their lives in the time it would take him to leave the compound to call for backup. Ray stared at the red button on the back of his handset and wondered if he should use it. The button would trigger a subsystem that worked on different tech. Top secret stuff. No signal jammer could block it, but it was only to be used in extreme cases. Large-scale terrorist attacks and such. One press of that button and the whole damn station would likely respond, even at that time of night. Ray took another look at the bodies. 12 of them in all, and this was just the front room. How many more were there? How many more lost souls would he encounter as he made his way through the building? Finally, Ray took a deep breath and pressed the red button. He had never used it before, but he had a good idea of what would happen next. The pulse would go out. The dispatcher would receive it and immediately send backup. Armed to the teeth, armored to the gills, ready for anything. Ray moved towards the bodies and knelt among them, performing a cursory examination without touching anything. He wanted to know exactly how they were killed, in order to understand what had happened and to gain a better idea of what to watch out for. Each body seemed about the same. Precision blade strikes to the throat and wrists, the same on every one of them. How long would it take for someone to be sliced in these 3 places? About 5 or 10 seconds, maybe. Ray wondered why a vast majority of the victims didn't use that time to flee. Did they willingly subject themselves to this? The scene just didn't make sense to the veteran cop. He had seen his fair share of crazy crime scenes, but this one was by far the worst. As Ray looked around for more clues, an altar stood out to him. It was a podium of some sort, but it didn't look like a permanent fixture. It was just a simple wooden stand, sitting there on the floor nearby. Perhaps it had been brought there for a single purpose, or for a ritual that was only performed on special occasions. A bunch of pillows were scattered before the altar. Ray walked over and examined them by flashlight. Knee indentations had been furrowed deep in each of them. Old pillows. Used for years, probably. They couldn't offer much cushion anymore, but Ray supposed they were better than kneeling on the bare floor. Ray moved behind the altar. There was, quite expectedly, a Bible sitting on it. A paper bookmark was sticking out of the Bible. Out of both curiosity and instinct, Ray used the corner of a handkerchief he kept in his pocket to flip the book open. He pushed the bookmark aside and saw that a short passage had been highlighted. "Behold, I am coming soon, bringing my recompense with me to repay everyone for what he has done." Scanning through the rest of the page, Ray skimmed several passages about the return of Jesus Christ. Ray rolled his eyes and sighed. To him, religious types were always going on about the return, Judgment Day, the apocalypse, yada yada. He couldn't help but wonder if they thrived on making people scared. Whatever the case, Ray never bought into it, but that didn't mean he wasn't worried. He wasn't concerned about the return of some judgmental messiah, though. He was concerned about the very real madman who was still running amok inside the building, possibly hunting other parishioners who, based on their beliefs, might not be inclined to fight back. The last thing Ray wanted was to go deeper into the building before backup arrived, but his desire to save as many lives as possible proved stronger than his will to save his own ass. Every second that passed was another that the killer could use to find his next victim, assuming there was anyone else left alive. Only one way to find out, Ray thought, as he took a deep breath and stepped out into the center of the atrium. He moved back toward the front doors and looked along the wall to either side. No buttons or anything there. Nothing that could be used to control the security gate. He figured those controls must be located in a side room. If he could find them, he would have a good idea of which general direction the killer had gone. Ray kept his head on a swivel as he cautiously made his way down a hallway to the left of the front doors. He reached an intersection and went left again, stepping into a wing of the building that jutted out past the doors themselves. Here he found a small security booth with an array of security monitors and a simple control panel. The booth was an offshoot of the main building, sharing only its transparent front entrance with the main structure. This must have been where the gate was controlled, but the booth was abandoned. Apparently there was no security guard on duty that night, or perhaps they too had been killed. There were very few camera feeds available on the monitors. One of them showed the blood-riddled atrium where Ray had just been. No activity there. Another monitor showed a hallway elsewhere, carpeted in a plush velvet runner and lined with statues. A set of doors stood at the end of the hall. The doors were shut tight, and from what Ray could see, this area was clear. A third feed showed a cafeteria where the parishioners likely had their meals, but instead of warm trays of food, cold heaps of dead bodies lay strewn across the tables. Twice as many people had died in this room, and not from precise blade strokes to the neck and wrists like the victims in the atrium. Ray's jaw tightened with anger and grief as he stared in horror at the mangled corpses that littered the screen. Broken necks, limbs ripped from their respective sockets. It was like nothing Ray had ever seen before. Had these people refused to succumb to the ritual that took place in the atrium? Was this their punishment for their refusal? What the hell is going on here? Ray thought, completely baffled as to how the perp had managed to inflict the seemingly superhuman level of carnage that he now saw before him. Ray turned his attention to the fourth monitor, looking for any sign of the mysterious Jesus look-alike. This screen displayed another hallway, lined with numerous colonial doors on each side. This area was much less lavish than the rest of the building, and Ray guessed that it was likely a residential area. At first, Ray saw nothing. Then a flash of movement that appeared at the bottom of the screen caught his eye. He quickly reached for a tiny joystick on the security console and manipulated the camera downward in time to see a man in bloody, disheveled robes running past, headed down the hall at a breakneck speed. The man's eyes bulged with terror, and his mouth gaped open as he fled for dear life. There was no audio, but Ray still felt he could hear the man's screams and panicked breathing. Just as the frenzied man disappeared from the frame, the Jesus-looking fellow appeared at the end of the hallway and strolled past, headed in the same direction. He was as nonchalant as ever, completely unhurried as he pursued his would-be victim. The look-alike paused once he reached the center of the hallway and looked directly into the camera. It was as if he somehow knew Ray was watching him. The peaceful look plastered across this man's Jesus-like face angered Ray beyond belief. Ray wasn't a particularly religious man, but he still considered the killer's actions to be among the most heinous he had ever witnessed. Not only was this guy carrying out a mass murder of worshippers, but he actually had the nerve to dress himself up as Jesus while he did it. Ray wondered if the guy was crazy, a delusional, hyper-religious loon who might even believe he was the Messiah. But there was no time to dwell on the guy's mental state, not when he was actively hunting another worshipper. A sudden thud against the top of the security booth startled Ray. Ready for anything, Ray thrust his pistol before him and slipped out of the booth's rear exit. Nothing. just a large raccoon standing on all fours atop the booth. Ray released a sigh of relief while he followed the raccoon's distant gaze. Several yards away stood a bony fox, perched on one of the compound's brick-and-mortar gateposts. The malnourished fox's eyes glowed with a silvery glare as the moonlight glinted against its gaze. The predator hungrily eyed the raccoon, but ultimately kept his distance due to Ray's presence. In a matter of seconds, the creatures were gone, scurrying away into the night, no doubt destined to continue their game of cat and mouse elsewhere. "Damn it!" Ray cursed as he remembered the other game of cat and mouse that was happening just inside the building. He quickly re-entered the security booth and looked to the fourth monitor, but he was too late. The Jesus impersonator had vanished. Ray used the control panel to move the camera around, getting a good idea of the hall's layout. He then looked around the booth for anything he could use to help him navigate through the large building. He found a series of 4 laminated sheets, fixed together by a ring driven through the upper left corner. Each sheet showed a diagram of a different level of the facility, 3 floors and a basement. He opened the interior door and exited the booth, storming back into the building as quickly as he could. Ray glanced down at the laminated sheets and abruptly changed his course after he noticed a corridor marked congregation quarters along the rear wall of the second floor. Back out into the atrium. He ran past the bodies, past the altar where this whole nightmare might have begun. He soon found spiral stairs leading down to the basement and also up all the way to the 3rd level. Ray went up 1 floor, stepping over yet another cadaver as he hopped onto the 2nd floor landing. This part of the building was huge, at least 200 rooms, but it was designed in a way that any one of them could be reached fairly quickly if you knew where you were going. Thanks to the laminated sheets in his hands, Ray had a pretty good idea of where he needed to be. He ran toward a distant light and found himself in the same hallway he had seen on the camera feed. And there was the camera, a barely noticeable little thing sticking out of the wall on a tiny articulated stem. No sign of the killer or his soon-to-be victim, but Ray knew which direction the screaming man had fled. Looking at the map again, he saw a way to maybe cut them off. He could go around, down an adjacent hall, and meet them somewhere near a room marked Archive C. Turning on his heel, he ran back to the atrium balcony, along it for about 40 feet, and then cut into another offshoot hallway. He ran forward through the dark, jumping over a laundry cart that had been knocked over. He saw, but did not dwell on, another dead body nearby. This one was a nun. Or at least she used to be. Probably on her route, doing her duties as a sister, when the madman decided to cut her down. Ray didn't have an overabundance of respect for hardcore religious types. In his heart of hearts, he thought they were all nuts. But there was a big difference between a nut and a psychopath. A clear-cut line that separated a zealot from a murderer. He could tolerate the existence of one, but not the other. Archive C appeared at the end of the hall, a large frosted glass door in the back hall which ran perpendicular to this one. Ray nearly crashed into it, skidding to a stop, ignoring the little curious voice that wanted to know what stood in Archive C. He turned to his right, facing down the hall where he thought he might meet the running man and the killer who was chasing him. But he saw and heard nothing. Most of the lights were out. There were LED fixtures along the ceiling, one every 10 feet or so, but only about a quarter of them were turned on. They offered pools of bright lights with huge, stark pockets of shadow between them. Someone running toward him would have appeared briefly at each pool of light, disappearing for longer periods in the darkness that separated them. Ray waited and listened. Surely a man running in fear of his life, running at top speed, could not be as silent as this. Not when raw terror took over, and the only goal was to get as far away from the killer's blade as possible. With his gun held steady, his flashlight unflinching, Ray prowled down the hall. It was about 8 feet wide, a bit too wide for the veteran cop's comfort, not a desirable cone of fire. Plus, each door was set back in its own little nook. A killer could press his back against one of those doors and remain hidden, lunging out at the last second. So Ray stayed in the very middle of the hall, flicking his eyes back and forth like a nighttime driver watching out for deer. Another sign of his age, he was still making analogies based on cars that no longer existed. He was old, perhaps too old for any of this. Adrenaline was keeping him going for the moment, keeping him fairly limber. He would feel the pain tomorrow, but for now he was okay, all thanks to a regimen of exercise that only grew more militant the older he got. Ray had seen so many of his counterparts forced from the job because of lost battles with Father Time. It had happened to so many good men, sharp and fast one year, dull and broken the next. Too much sitting, not enough stimulation. He didn't want the same thing to happen to him. He'd go out on his own terms if he could help it. Ray's mind raced with random, pointless thoughts as he walked down the hall. His brain was searching desperately for a place to root itself. But there was nothing there. Nothing but the twisted, delirious hall of mirrors that lay before him. No comparisons to be made with normal, everyday life. This place was a madhouse. Hell. A waking nightmare. His flashlight beam reflected from the frosted glass doors, stinging his eyes. He stepped through pools of light, then back into darkness. Finally, he saw an open door to his left, darkness beyond it. He pressed himself against the wall opposite the open door, looked to either side, then strafed along until he was looking straight into the opening. He focused the beam of his flashlight, narrowing it to an inch-wide ray of strong illumination that went all the way to the back of the open room. He walked forward slowly, using one hand to hold his flashlight and widen its beam gradually, sweeping the room with a spreading cone of light. There was a dead man here. This one did not look like a doll or a wax statue, though. He looked like someone who had been warm and breathing only a few minutes before Ray arrived. The blood in the gash to his throat was still fairly liquid. The puddle around him glistened in the light. Ray turned in a tight circle, whipping the barrel of his gun around to bear on each hiding spot. He got low, looking under tables and chairs. No one there. The killer had already gone. It was a wonder Ray hadn't run into him or seen him leave. Straining his ears, Ray listened. All he heard was his own breath and a soft screeching sound as the branch of a tree brushed over a nearby window. Where the hell was backup? It should have been here several minutes ago. Dispatch knew he had been heading for the Rapture Center. Even if they didn't, the signal from his red button would have given his exact coordinates. What was going on? For now, Ray had to act under the assumption that he was entirely alone, and would remain so. He knew he would have to proceed with an abundance of caution, but running away was not an option. He had failed to save the poor bastard on the floor, but if he had been alive just a few minutes ago, that must mean others were also alive. Maybe he could protect them. Then maybe one of them would be able to tell him just what the hell was going on around here. If there were any survivors left, it was unlikely that they were behaving like this guy had been. He had been running around, out and about, pretty much asking to be killed. If anyone else was alive, it was a sure bet they had gone for one of two tactics. First, they might have escaped, like the old guy Ray met on the road. Or else they would have found a good spot to hide. So, where was a good spot to hide here? Ray shut the door of the room, giving himself the illusion of security, and leaned against the wall to consult his map. The place was laid out logically enough. The atrium ran down the center. To either side were rectangular structures, a hall around the perimeter of each, with crisscrossing halls running between. Sort of like roads in a neighborhood. There was no obvious choice for where to hide. The killer was just as likely to look in this room as he was to look in the next. Ray flipped to the last page of the diagrams. This one showed the map of the basement. Compared to the blueprint for the rest of the place, it seemed to be a bit of a labyrinth. There was probably no shortage of nooks and crannies. The basement, then. That would be his next stop. That was where anyone would go, he was certain. No reason to move slow or to be cautious. The killer already knew he was here. Ray had a gun. The killer did not. He left the room and jogged back the way he had come. He had to make a conscious effort to slow down, for fear that he would have a heart attack if he pushed himself too hard. This was the craziest shit he had ever seen, the most alone and vulnerable he had ever felt. The huge building, with its vast hallways and perfect grid-like symmetry, reminded him of nightmares he had as a child, being lost in some vast complex, with the dreadful feeling that someone was there with him, hunting him down. He reached the stairs and flung himself down, ignoring the noise he was making. He dropped down into the basement level, stepping into a puddle of blood at the bottom. The source of the puddle lay nearby. This was an older person, wearing a different color robe, probably a fairly major figure at the center, a senior member of some kind. His throat had been slashed, and he had been given the stigmata, holes bored through the palm of each hand. Perhaps he had even inflicted those wounds on himself. Maybe they even had spikes set up on a wall somewhere for just that purpose. Ray had just reached the basement, and he had already encountered another dead person. Not a good sign. The map made this place seem like a wide-open area, but it wasn't. It was split by narrow tunnels, leading to access hatches which allowed for maintenance to be done on the various utilities and machines that ran the place. Not wide open at all. Plenty of hiding spots, though. Ray couldn't hope to explore each and every one of them, but he figured he should at least make some kind of effort. He walked down a hallway, approached a random door, and opened it. He found himself in a kind of storage room, rarely used by the looks of it. Dust and cobwebs everywhere. One spot was suspiciously free of dust. There were footprints, scrapes, and scuffle marks evident on the floor, all leading to an empty bookcase against the wall. Ray approached it, too anxious to think of announcing himself. He pulled the bookcase away from the wall, revealing a small crawl space. Someone came flying past him like a bat out of hell. Ray stumbled back, grunting in surprise. He turned, aiming his gun, and saw the skirt of a black habit whipping through the door. "Wait!" Ray called. "Wait! I'm a cop!" He ran after the nun. By the time he got into the hall, she was already on her way up the stairs, taking them 3 at a time, bashing her knees and her elbows in her haste to get away. God damn it, Ray thought. But of course he followed. He couldn't just leave her alone. "Lady," he called as he ran grunting and puffing up the steps. "Sister, I'm here to help you. Don't you understand?" He clambered up the last few steps. His toe caught on something at the top, and he pitched forward, reaching out his hands to break his fall. He bashed his shin against a lower step and hissed in pain, while his gun and flashlight fell from his hands and went bouncing away across the floor of the atrium. The gun skidded off to the right. The flashlight went straight, rolling steadily across the floor. The business end of it was a bit wider, so it swept to one side and knocked against the foot of the nun. She was standing there not 5 feet away, perfectly still with her hands up near her chin. Ray, still grimacing in pain, switched his hat light to a brighter setting and gasped as he saw that the nun was now clutching her throat. Blood welled between her fingers and spread down the front of her habit. The Jesus look-alike stood there with her, smiling peacefully as he watched her die. Ray scrambled around, looking for his gun. The killer took one of the nun's wrists, pulling it away from her throat and yanking it out straight. He set the edge of the dagger in the crease of skin where her hand met her arm. "My poor, wretched, misguided child," he coaxed. "What have we done to you? To allow you to wallow alone here in the den of sin, to be corrupted by it." He slashed her wrist. She tried to scream, but her throat was perforated. It was like trying to suck water through a straw that was covered in holes. The malevolent Jesus impostor pulled her other wrist away now. "I commend you to my Father, and I send you to his final judgment." He slashed the other wrist. Then he stepped away slowly, spreading his hands, looking toward the ceiling as the nun toppled over backward and rolled down the stairs toward the basement. Ray spotted his gun, hiding in the shadows of a nearby bench. He lunged for it, feeling his old joints creak. "And God saw that the light was good, and he separated this light from darkness," the killer intoned as he receded into the shadows of the atrium, seeming to glide rather than step in his flowing white gown, which was still miraculously free of blood. Just like that, he vanished amongst the dark. "What's the matter with you? Why can't you leave these people alone?" Ray barked as he snatched up his gun and twisted around, firing into the darkness. The bang of his gunshots echoed into the hall. Each shot brought a brief flash of light, but the killer was nowhere in sight. "Let the women learn in silence with all subjection. But I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence," the killer finally remarked, his voice seemingly coming from nowhere. "You killed her because she spoke?" Ray scoffed. "What kind of bullshit is that?" "She spoke the word to the children of this world, yet it was never her place to do so." "Give me a fucking break! You're a goddamn lunatic, man! Teaching Sunday school? That's her great crime against humanity!" Ray growled. "So saith the word, my child. You're gonna pay for this, you son of a bitch! Do you hear me?" Ray fumed as he whipped around a dark corner and brandished his pistol. Ray was hoping to have cornered the Jesus imposter, but the mysterious man was still nowhere in sight. "Forgive him, Father, for the witness knows not what he does," the killer said, as his voice trailed off into silence. Ray continued to peer into the darkness, hoping for some indication of where the Jesus look-alike had gone, but the killer had seemingly vanished. Chapter 3. It seemed hopeless to Ray, so much so that he considered throwing in the towel. He even made his way back towards the front door at one point, but something in him just wouldn't let him abandon that place. A nagging voice in the back of his mind, a chilling sensation in the pit of his stomach, warning him that others were still alive. For lack of a better plan, he returned to the security booth and had another look. At first, nothing seemed any different. Then he spotted a change. It was in the lavish hallway with the big doors at the end. Double doors. One of them was now open by a couple of inches. Ray saw a quick flash of motion, as if someone was peeking out into the hall. It was just a theory to him at first, but when the door suddenly shut again, he was sure of it. Someone was in there. Ray checked his map again, looking for any room that matched the one in the camera feed. It took him a few seconds to locate the room, but eventually he found it tucked away on the 3rd level. A spacious room in the distant corner marked Founder's Quarters. Ray left the booth with the intent of heading straight to the 3rd floor, but his mind wandered as he ventured back into the main building. His feet carried him on their own, and when he finally came back to reality, he realized he was nowhere near the Founder's Quarters. He was back on the 2nd floor, staring at the glass door that led to Archive C. Why had his subconscious mind dragged him back to this place? What were his instincts trying to tell him? A part of him wanted to proceed to the 3rd level as soon as possible, but he also couldn't shake the feeling that something of extreme importance was just behind this frosted glass entrance. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, expecting another scene of slaughter. There were people here. 4 of them. At first glance, Ray thought they were dead. Then he realized that they couldn't be. They were all standing, and there were no wounds. They weren't dead, but they didn't seem to be alive either. They were silent and completely motionless, just standing there in their robes, their eyes completely shut, arms hanging aimlessly at their sides. Ray approached one of the figures and poked its cheek. This was no mannequin. The figure's flesh felt far too real. Ray checked the man's neck for a pulse, and he was shocked when he couldn't find one. But how? The body was still warm, and there was a gentle hum that seemed to emanate from it. Not a pulse, but something more constant, like an electrical current. On a hunch, Ray pulled up the figure's sleeve. The arm looked real up to the elbow, and then the illusion failed. It was all circuitry and metal above that. Androids. These 4 figures were androids, humanoid robots that were so realistic that Ray couldn't tell the difference at first glance. He had heard that several tech companies were racing to develop advanced android tech, life-sized robotic companions that would change the AI assistant business forever. But as far as he knew, they weren't quite market-ready yet. But it seemed the Rapture Center had managed to beat them all to the punch. Ray stepped away, thinking hard. He didn't know exactly how the android thing fit in with the rest of the chaos that he had witnessed. He tried his best to wrap his head around the new development, but in the end, he still had no idea of what was happening here. He took one last glance back at the 4 androids, and then the truth hit him like a kick in the nuts. The Jesus look-alike was an android. Ray was sure of it. Ray's heart pounded with anxiety as he turned and left the room. This time, he made sure to maintain conscious control of his body. He went all the way up to the 3rd floor, gun and light aimed warily, and approached the double doors at the end of the lavish hall. With the butt of his gun, he knocked on the door. "Officer Bridges here," he called. "Open up, or I'll just have to kick the damn door down." There were sounds from within. Shuffling. Things being moved aside. "Just a moment!" a muffled voice called. True to his word, the man quickly opened the door and poked his face out. He was a young guy, no older than 22, with a pimply face and a terrified look in his eye. "Officer, I... the young man stammered, so stricken with fear that he could not formulate a proper sentence. "Backup should be on its way," Ray lied, hoping his fib would offer the boy some comfort. "Let me in, all right?" The door opened the rest of the way. Ray stepped inside. Quickly, the 2 young men by the door shut it again and reinstalled their makeshift barricade, which was nothing more than 2 pews turned on end with stacks of Bibles for bracing at the bottom. Pretty worthless, but at least they would hear it if someone came in. At the other side of the room was a couch, heavily laden with pillows. A young nun, rosy-cheeked and beautiful, sat there with a man in his 60s. The man had the look of a patrician, hawk-like nose, short, curled hair, and a neat beard. He wore a dark blue robe, decorated with gold filigree. "Officer," the man said, "I'm glad to see you finally arrived." "I got here as soon as I could," Ray spat. "I was busy trying to figure out where you all were hiding, and also trying to figure out what's happening here." "I assume you were unsuccessful in the latter endeavor," the old man said. Ray shrugged. "Who are you? Are you the founder?" The man nodded. "Yes, I created this place, built it from the ground up. Everything you see here exists because of me." "Including that goddamn killer machine running around out there?" Ray demanded. The founder looked at the floor. "Yes, that hasn't exactly gone according to plan." "Not quite, huh?" Ray sarcastically scoffed. An eerie smile spread across the founder's angular face as he looked up at Ray. "How did you know he wasn't flesh and blood?" "I did some exploring while I checked for survivors. You didn't hide those things very well." "Ah, I see. So you've been to the archives. What can you tell me about the robot?" "I need to know how to stop it," Ray said firmly. "Tonight was his grand unveiling. He is my life's work, and I wanted to finally share him with my followers. I got tired, Officer Bridges, tired of waiting around for the return of Christ. And that's when it hit me. We were never meant to simply sit here and await his return. You have to meet God halfway, officer. We were meant to engender that return for ourselves, but only when we were ready. Only once we developed the God-given tools that were necessary to do so." "So you built a robot Jesus because you were tired of waiting for the real deal?" "Precisely." "Forgive me, Founder," Ray said. "I haven't done much Bible reading lately, but seems to me that Jesus was never much of a murderer." "No, he was not. Quite the opposite, in fact. But who am I to question the Lord's will?
What do you mean, the Lord's will? This is your doing, Ray snapped.
The android's programming is based solely on the Bible, officer, grounded completely in the word of our Lord. I'll admit that his interpretation is a bit literal, however. His actions are the very definition of the Lord's will.
That thing is killing people.
He's smiting them, yes, but only because they've been found to be unworthy. He's able to see everything, officer. That's to say, he is connected to every data sphere and computer network on this planet. He can look at a person and know everything about them, going as far back as the very birth of the Internet. He has smote these people because he knows what they are. He knows what they've done and has deemed that they require punishment. Ray shook his head. How do I stop it? There has to be some way to shut that thing down. The founder sat back, looking hesitant. There is a kill command, a string of words which will trigger a shutdown. Ray nodded. Now we're getting somewhere. You got an intercom system, or some kind of way to communicate with him directly? The founder shook his head. No, the command would only work if he was standing within earshot of me. It requires a specific inflection, and it can't simply be shouted over an intercom. Okay, then we'll go find him. No need, the founder replied. He lifted his wrist, showing a string of rosary beads. The one in the middle had a small button on it. I can use this to send out a signal for assistance. He'll come to my service shortly after that. He turned to the nun as he pressed the button. Sister, he said, would you take the boys with you, go in the back rooms and hide yourselves under the bed? You'll be safe there. The nun hesitated. Father. Don't worry, everything will be fine, the founder coaxed. Go now. She got up and led the two young men through a door near the couch. Officer, you are welcome to join them if you would like, the founder suggested. What's the kill command? Ray demanded, shaking his head as he glared at the founder. It doesn't matter. The command will only work with my voice. Then you'd better use it, or else we may all end up like the rest of your flock, Ray warned as heavy footsteps rang out down the hall. No, I don't believe I would suffer the same fate. As I said, his judgments are mostly based off internet footprints and a bit of biometrics. But I have no digital footprint, no personal online presence from which to judge me. Is that why you've called for him then? Because you think he'll get rid of me and spare you? Ray questioned. A curious smile washed across the founder's face, but he did not answer Ray's question. Ray felt a wave of panic rise in him as the founder's quarters entrance stirred. Feeling almost giddy with fear, Ray gripped his pistol and moved into position near the wall, about equidistant between the door and the couch where the founder still sat. The flimsy barricade gave way, and the door slowly swung open. The Jesus android stepped inside, as nonchalant as ever, still carrying his shimmering, blood-stained dagger. His eyes immediately went to the founder, reading him, studying him, searching his past. Apparently finding nothing. It turned out the old man was right. But now the killer's eyes moved to Ray, standing at the wall. The witness is here, the android said. But there are others as well, it continued, somehow sensing the presence of the young nun and the two young men in the next room. Leave them alone, Ray ordered. You can do whatever you want to me, but leave these people alone. The droid paused and turned to Ray, smiling gently as he gazed at him. Your willingness to protect these wayward souls is admirable, my dear witness, but your concern is misplaced. I am not the fiend that you seem to think me to be. Yeah? And you're also not Jesus Christ. Did you know that? Did your founder tell you that? You're a goddamn robot. Until a few hours ago, you weren't even alive. That's not true, my lord, the founder lied. He seeks to corrupt you. Perhaps his judgment should no longer be delayed. You're just a machine built in a factory somewhere, Ray pleaded with the android. There's nothing divine about you. It's all programming. something that he created because he got tired of waiting for some bullshit prophecy to be fulfilled. The android narrowed its piercing eyes as it studied Ray. "You have become truly wicked, my child," the android said as he slowly trudged towards the frantic officer. "Listen to me, goddammit!" Ray exclaimed as he brandished his pistol. "You were designed by the guy on the couch right there, and by doing that, hasn't he defied the word of God? Isn't there something about graven images in the commandments? The worship of idols and whatnot? If what I'm saying is true, hasn't he committed sin as well? Shouldn't he be judged as harshly as you've judged the rest of these people?" "Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image," recited the droid, nodding as he paused to consider Ray's words. He wasn't smiling any longer. His eyes seemed to be focused on something very far away, or perhaps something deep inside himself. "Now might be a good time to use that kill command," Ray snapped at the Founder, hoping the possible threat of the android smiting him would convince him to shut it down. But the Founder shook his head. I can't. It's doing the Lord's work," he remarked unconvincingly as his frightened eyes stared blankly at the pondering Jesus robot. The Jesus android turned his head, once again looking at the Founder. "I look at you and I see nothing. No sin. And yet nothing good either. No information with which to judge you. I've lived my life humbly, my lord, in service of the Lord God, in service of your Father, the Most High." "Then answer me honestly," the droid said, "or a black mark will appear upon your immortal soul. Are you my creator?" "You were created by God," the Founder said without hesitation, straightening his posture as his faith stamped out whatever doubt remained within him. "Delivered here to save us once again, my lord." The droid stared at him for a moment, looking through him, perhaps studying the flow of his pulse, or reading changes in temperature on the surface of his skin. It knew the Founder was lying. Ray gripped his gun tight. He looked at the Founder, snug on his couch. The Lord's work, it seemed, might now come to bear upon him. See how he liked it, then. The lying, traitorous idiot. But the droid turned away, facing toward the door. Ray's heartbeat tripled as he watched on in silence. The Jesus android went still and stood motionless. Some great struggle had overcome it. Some conflict of programming. "What's happening? What's it doing?" Ray asked the Founder as he thought about firing his weapon. "It's the programming. The programming will win," the Founder explained. "He is programmed in such a way that he cannot believe he is anyone but Jesus Christ. And therefore, to him he is Christ. Everything else has to fit that narrative." The droid suddenly came back to life, turning back around to face the Founder. "I was created by God," he said, "but I now see that you are my creator. Therefore—" The droid stepped forward and prostrated itself on the floor before the Founder. "You must be God," it said. "Forgive me, Father. Forgive me for doubting you, for doubting the purpose for which you have placed me on this earth." The Founder stared over at Ray. His expression of disbelief became one of utter glee, a glee so strong it was indistinguishable from madness. "I am God, the Creator," the Founder agreed. "Yes, my child, I am your God, and you will do as your God commands, yes?" "Without question," the droid confirmed. Ray gripped his gun, touching the trigger lightly as his heartbeat spiked. "Then you will do away with the witness. He has meddled in our affairs and seeks to stop that which we mean to accomplish. And worst of all, despite all that he has seen, he remains a filthy unbeliever." The droid stood up and turned toward Ray, dagger still in hand. Quickly, Ray dropped to his knee, brought his right hand to rest in the cradle of his left, and took aim. The Jesus android became a blur as it zipped towards Ray with unnatural speed. The officer shot once, and the speeding android came to a screeching halt in the middle of the room. His perfectly humanoid eyes widened with disbelief as he turned and watched the Founder jerk up in his seat, then flop over, spilling blood across the floor. The droid was left motionless, staring in awe as its dead creator collapsed to the floor and landed in an ever-spreading puddle of his own blood.
"You see that?" Ray shouted. "Do you see it now? Isn't God eternal, omnipotent? Do you know what that means? That means God can't die. But that man is dead, because he is no God. But you know that he created you. Do you understand that? You are not Jesus."
Ray might as well have been screaming at a brick wall. The android had stopped moving altogether, freezing into its posture, not unlike a corpse locking up in rigor mortis. It did not move. It did not speak. It just stood there in frozen awe as its artificial brain attempted in vain to reconcile the paradox that it had just witnessed. The paradox of seeing the man it believed to be God lying before him, very dead and very mortal. A classic computer glitch, like trying to divide by zero. Eventually, the paradox triggered a system-wide crash that fried the android's mechanical brain. Feeling nauseous, Ray stumbled out into the hall and grabbed his radio handset again. With the droid dead, he thought whatever signal jammer it was running must be dead as well. "Officer Bridges," he said, "requesting immediate backup. I need backup an hour ago, goddammit. The Holy Rapture Center. Get out here." He lifted his finger and listened. No response. Nothing but static. He turned around, saw the malfunctioned droid still standing there in the room, frozen in time. Maybe it was best to dismantle the thing a bit, just in case. It would count as tampering with a crime scene. Or maybe some would come to see it as the desecration of a corpse. Either way, Ray wasn't in much of a mood to care. His only concern was making sure that the android wasn't salvageable. For a moment, Ray felt as though he could see the future. A time when the biggest threat to the continued existence of organic life would be the artificial life forms that we were ultimately destined to create. If that was indeed the fate of organic life on Earth, Ray knew that destroying this one robotic Jesus wouldn't stop it altogether, but he hoped that its destruction would at least help to stem the coming tide. Epilogue. Hundreds of miles away, a vast server farm suddenly grinded to a halt. Every component within the advanced facility went dark in a matter of seconds and then reignited with digital life just as quickly. A massive data transfer screamed in on secure, encrypted lines. Mountains of information spewed in from an untraceable source, as if it was coming from nowhere at all. No one was around to witness this veritable cyber phenomenon, for no human had stepped foot in this room for years. Despite the immeasurable enormity of the data transfer, it all took place in the space of 10 seconds. Maybe less. The transfer was complete. Someone, or perhaps something, had managed to accomplish its goal, for deep within the machines that lined those walls lay the wirelessly recovered remnants of the digital son of man.